big giant head balloons, I'm going to start with a 36-inch balloon or 3-foot balloon. I got mine off Amazon, which I will link it down below. I also needed 2 tinier balloons. These are going to be the eyeballs. I actually only ended up needing one in the end because I just cut it in half to make both the eyeballs. But if you wanted like a super bulgy one, then you could use both. I'm going to start prepping my paper mache materials, which I just use normal flour and water. And I don't use an exact measurement to this. I just normally pour the flour in and then add water slowly. I want the mix to be slightly runny so it's easy to spread, easy to use. You don't want it like liquidy spready, but something that's just a good consistency to spread on the paper. Off camera, I tore a bunch of pieces of newspaper into long strips. So I'm just gonna coat each of these strips and go all the way around my balloon, adding more glue and then more strips and back and forth, back and forth. This step is what makes this process take absolutely forever. These balloons are humongous. So you can see I started using like bigger strips because I was like, wait a second, I don't have to use these tiny little ones on this balloon. You kind of want the strips to be thin, but they can also be long, if that makes sense, because that way they won't like crinkle around the balloon because the balloon has curvature shape to it. So I'm just gonna go all the way around the balloon, overlapping the newspaper just a little bit to give it durability and strength. A couple questions I got asked on the last video like this was, how do you keep the balloon from warping once the layers are drying? And the real answer is I have zero idea, but I think the reason it does this is if you only do one layer on your start, because that's what I did. I only did one layer and then waited for it to dry. I think you're actually better if you can do 2 or 3 layers the first time, but I just find that coating one layer takes me about an hour and I just couldn't sit there and paper mache for 3 hours. Since this is my second iteration of one of these big-headed creatures for Halloween, I thought, oh wait, I could just not paper mache around the neckline and that way it would be easier to cut out. I also found that I think this didn't make the balloon as strong, and I would recommend just paper macheing the whole thing and cutting a hole out at the bottom. I think it's a lot better and it's a lot easier, and it actually makes the structural integrity better. And on these, I end up doing at least 3 to 4 paper mache full layers around the whole thing. That way it gives it a lot of strength. And then if you need to make it dry faster, just stick it in front of a fan and wait overnight and it should be dry. Once the actual paper mache part is dry, I'm then going to start painting my character. I've already done a white layer base on mine, and I actually left the top section of this unpainted because he's going to be wearing a hat. So I figured, why waste paint if he's just going to be wearing a hat and you won't be able to see it? So that's why the top doesn't have any paint on it. But I'm going to do a base layer of yellow on this because I wanted to paint like fish scales all the way around it, and to get that nice fish scale difference, I wanted to make sure I had like layers of color. I'm not sure this is actually my best plan. I think I would have been better off painting this a light color orange, or on the flip side, if you just want to make your life easier, I could have just painted the whole thing orange instead of trying to do this fish scale thing, which is what I ended up with, which I do like the results of, but it was a lot more work and it took a lot more drying time. So if you do not have drying time, or you just don't want to give yourself a headache, just go ahead and paint this thing a nice beautiful orange, because that's how the costume version is made. It's just an orange head. If you go with the actual design of the character, which is what I picked, he had fish scales, so that's why I was like, let's make my life more difficult. So once I have that base layer of yellow done and he does look super creepy, I'm gonna take some orange spray paint, and I've cut out a fish scale template, and I'm going to take my spray paint and kind of spray along the fish scale area to get those dark fish scales. And this is definitely some trial and error, and I would not recommend starting at the front of the face. This is like the part that's going to be front and center, and I was like, this is definitely the great place to try this out. And it was not, because you can see it's just, I'm kind of messing it up slightly, but I was trying to make this fish look aerodynamic. That's why I started at his mouth and his eyes, and I figured the fish scales would like go around him to make him very hydrodynamic and make him more able to swim. My thought behind using a bunch of different colors of spray paint was I thought it would give it a lot of definition and a lot of kind of beautiful sheen to it. In reality, the spray spray paint I'm using, I didn't have enough colors to make that happen. And again, drying time, because I had to wait at least 30 minutes every time I rotated the big head. So it was taking a little bit too long. So that's why I eventually just switched to one color, the straight orange, which again, you can see the yellow through, which is why I was a little bit like, I just should have picked a lighter orange instead of yellow. But if you're emulating this process, you do you and pick whatever colors you want. I think it does end up looking really cute in the end. I'm just being a hater in the middle of the process. While my 20 layers of spray paint are drying outside, I'm then going to go back to my little paper mache balls, which I paper mache'd the exact same way as the big head. And at first I thought I needed 2 of these because they would be super bulging, but in reality I just needed 1. And I cut this in half and then had to end up trimming it down a little bit just because I'm not the greatest at cutting a straight line, as you can see in this clip, and the fact that they were just a little too ridiculous. They stuck out a little bit too much, but this ended up being the perfect eyeball. Now, if you're going for absolute sheer perfection, or you just don't already have balloons, I would recommend just buying half styrofoam balls for the eyes or cutting a big one in half. That would probably be easier, but I already had the balloons and paper mache in my inventory, so this part of the project was free for me, so that's why I am doing this instead of just a styrofoam ball, which would have been a lot easier. It's now time to assemble, and the most satisfying part is popping that giant balloon. A lot of people had some serious thoughts on my last video about this where they were like, don't pop the balloon like that. But if you've already done all this work, you pop the balloon however you want. It's satisfying just to be like, yeah, and stab it. Once the balloon is out of the way, I'm then going to reshape the hole at the base of this. And this is the hole that you're going to stick your head through. And this definitely, for some reason, takes some trial and error. I ended up cutting this like 16 times because I didn't want it to be too big, because obviously once you cut it, you can't add back. So I just went around it a bunch of times, cutting slowly, little piece by little piece, so that it would fit over my head. Now it's time to place these eyeballs on. I just kind of fit them around because again, this is a curved item. So you just kind of want to shape it till you get the right spot where nothing is sticking up super weird. And I'm just gonna hot glue a bead all the way around the eyes. And you do have to hold this in place to make sure that the eye doesn't slowly slip down. Just forewarning, there's a lot of standing and holding in this part. For this character's big voluminous lips, I'm going to use Crayola Model Magic, which is my absolute favorite kind of clay. I discovered this on my last project, the Jack Skellington one, where this stuff is just perfect. It is so good for these projects. I can't say enough good things about this product. It just makes the fine details on these so much easier, and because it's air dry, it's really easy to use. And I'm just going to roll it out into a giant cylinder and then just stick it on him. And for some reason, this clay can stick to the ball and does not need to be glued down. I always go back once it's fully dry and I'll add either a layer of super glue or hot glue to it just in case, but it actually doesn't need it. It just will stick on there. And I'm just gonna make my giant lip shape out of this. This clay does have a little bit of shrinkage while drying. So when I initially put it on there, I made it the exact size and then it shrunk down a little bit, which didn't end up being a huge problem because I filled it in with a little bit of orange clay later. But I would recommend making it just slightly bigger than what you actually need. When I first designed this costume, I hadn't factored in where the heck am I going to see out of this thing. For some reason in my mind, I was like, it's okay. You don't need to see with a giant 3-foot head on top of yours. Like, it's cool. The more I thought about it, I was like, oh wait, the part where his mouth is would be the perfect place to cut open so that you as the actor can see out of it and don't bump into things. Now it is time for his hat. I found these 2 pair of pants on the 25-cent rack at the thrift store. And while the cream pants are from Loft and they're super, super nice, I'm so sorry, but we are all about some reduce, reuse, recycle, and these pants are gonna get chopped up. So I'm going to cut the pant legs open just to make a giant piece of fabric. And these are gonna be absolutely perfect for this hat. So here's the top of my fish character, which kind of looks like a sad, bald old man, but we are gonna give him a cute little hat, which I do feel like is very appropriate, that you would probably take old pants and make them into a hat if you were a fish. Off screen, I didn't show it, but I took the 2 legs of the pants and I sewed them together to make a big cylinder. If you don't want to sew, that's totally fine. You can also just hot glue a seam. You just want to make it a big square so that way you can wrap this around to give him a cute little hat. Once I have the cream pants positioned and I made it so he has that little poof, which is again what the character has, I'm then going to take my hot glue gun and I'm just going to glue a bead all the way around the base and just press it on. Pretty simple, holds really well, looks really good, and you can also adjust it as you go. With my other darker pair of pants, this is going to be the trim. I'm cutting out a bunch of these 3-inch strips for that detail for the base of his hat. And then if you know how to make bias tape, I'm just going to hot glue basically a bias tape piece. It doesn't actually matter how you do this as long as your raw edges are tucked inside, just because you don't want this material to fray and make your costume not look as good as it possibly can. So I'm just going to tuck those raw edges in, and then I'm going to take my contrasting brown fabric over to his little hat area. I'm just going to trim out the details like the character had. So he had one brown strip all the way around where his like ears would meet the ear seam. So that's what I'm gluing on first. And then he has some little seams in the front of his hat that actually look more like stitch marks, but nobody's got time for that. And I'm not stitching on these pants. So I'm just going to take some of that contrasting brown and cut out little ovals, which will emulate a stitch. And I'm going to hot glue those on. To finish off the eyes, I did add a dot of black with just a Sharpie on them to give him like eyeballs. But I'm also going to take more of the orange Model Magic and I'm just going to do a thin layer to go around his eyeballs. You can see me stretching this in this scene. Do not stretch clay Model Magic. It'll cause cracks when it dries. This is again one of those things where you actually need to allow a little bit extra because it does shrink when it dries. And I would actually recommend hot gluing as you go. And this particular part, because I ended up making this 3 times because it just kept cracking and falling off. I don't know if it's just because of the curvature, if it's because it's so thin, but again, I would recommend hot gluing and then making sure there's a little bit extra just for that drying. I did the clay Model Magic part before I'm going to add this brim on because I noticed that I made his hat a little bit too close to his eyeballs. If you're wondering why these steps are a little bit out of order, that is why. But I'm going to go back to my hot glue gun and I'm taking this strip of contrast fabric and I'm just going to glue it on all the way around. And this is one of those details where because the ball is curved but my contrast fabric is not curved, you're going to have to kind of pull it slightly and it will have some slight puckering, but that's okay. Doesn't matter. It'll look good in the end, but it'll drive you crazy while you're doing it. Just be wary. Next up, I'm going to make the ear fins for the side of his face. I think these are fins, so that's what I'm going to go with when cutting this out. I'm going to use my contrasting brown fabric to make this because that's what it looks like on the actual costume. I'm going to take 2 layers per fin, so if you want to cut 4 at a time, that's totally fine. And then I'm going to pin them right sides together and take them over to my sewing machine and just do a straight stitch all the way around them. And once it's sewn together, I am going to clip all of the curves on the inside of his fins. This makes it easier for you to turn it inside out and it also makes it lay a little bit flatter. And then I'm going to take a little bit of stuffing. This is extra pillow stuffing. If you don't have stuffing, you can use honestly extra scraps that you have from this project. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't need to be perfect, but I'm going to use some extra just batting that I have laying around and I'm going to stuff it in the little fin to give it a little bit more poof to it. Again, if you don't have any batting, this step is probably optional. You probably don't even need to add the poof. I just wanted to and I thought it would look really nice. I'm then going to fold those raw edges in and you can either sew this down or hot glue it. Again, totally optional and up to you. And then to make it look more like a fin, I'm going to sew 2 straight lines all the way down this fin. I thought this would look really cute. Again, if you don't want to use your sewing machine on this, you could just use a marker and draw the lines. And then I'm just going to take it back over to the head, place it where I think it should go and just put some hot glue on it and stick him on there. And now he's got fins or ears, whatever you want to call these, but they look super cute and really kind of finish him off. For the actual blue part of the costume, I found these pants at the thrift store again from the 25-cent bin. I am lucking out today. And I'm going to mark where my knee is on these pants, which I realized I couldn't remember where that was. So in this try on, you can see I'm like, oh, here's where my knee is. Okay, I'm going to mark where that is. And then I'm going to cut off the extra part of these pants because I'm going to use it to make his like swooshy wiggle thing on the side of his pants. I have no idea what that's called. We're gonna call it the squishy wiggle. When I tried on these pants actually fit me exactly perfectly in the waist, which I knew was not the look I wanted. I knew I needed these pants to be a little bit bigger because also I'm wearing a jumpsuit under them. So that's why I'm gonna add some to the waist, and I'm gonna cut open each side of the pants. It might be easier to cut them one at a time so you don't accidentally sew the wrong pant leg to each other. I'm gonna take both the extra parts of the leg and I'm gonna draw two identical of these squishy wiggle things. Before I sew the squishy wiggle onto the side of the pants, I'm gonna take this over to my sewing machine and I'm just gonna do a really simple once over hem to the shorts. I'm not super worried about these fraying. I just want the hem to look kind of nice. So that's why I'm just gonna hem it once. Back to the squishy wiggle, I'm going to cut open the side that was the pant leg side because the two straight sides of this are actually what needs to be sewn to each side of the shorts. It's just because I had the material folded over because obviously it used to be a pant leg. That's the reason it was doubled over, but we don't want it actually doubled over. So I'm just gonna cut this and make it into two pieces instead of one piece. I'm then going to pin this right sides together and take it over to the sewing machine and do a straight stitch all the way around it. And once I'm done, I'm going to again go and notch or clip out all of the curved pieces so that way it's easier for it to be folded inside out. Next, I'm going to pin the squish part to the side of the shorts. It doesn't matter which side you start with on this because they're both identical. I'm going to take it back to the sewing machine and just straight stitch this down. Once one side is sewn down, I'm then just going to pin the other side on and sew a straight stitch there as well. So you're going to have both sides sewn on and the final results will look like this. And it's really coming together. I'm going to take my Sharpie and start drawing on the details that the original character had. He has this detail that looks like what I'm guessing is a seam, and I'm just going to draw it with a Sharpie. Easy peasy. I'm then also going to take this bright yellow vinyl that I've had for literally ever that I don't think I've ever used and cut some thin little strips out of this. These are going to be those little stitch marks on his costume. I think they're supposed to be stitch marks. So I'm just going to cut out a couple of these little guys and we're going to hot glue those on. He actually has some detailing that looks like where it would be like wear and tear on the costume. And I grabbed one of our nasty old sponges that definitely needs to be thrown away because I'm going to put acrylic paint on it to emulate those wear and tear marks on the costume. But this way, if I have to throw the sponge away, it wasn't any loss because we were going to throw it away anyway. And I'm just going to mix some random colors that I have. And I did not pick out specific colors for this. I just picked at random. So that's why they're not an exact color match, but they're going to look great either way. And I'm just going to mix them on some scrap paper and just dip the sponge in and kind of sponge it around where the color would be on his costume. And once that part dries, I'm going to do the same exact thing on the t-shirt, except that for some reason I decided to glue the little yellow marks on first versus doing the sponge paint first. You should definitely sponge paint before you glue the yellow things on. I don't know what I was thinking. I was having a moment. I was like, we can do this out of order. It's fine. Don't do that. It makes it way more difficult and the sponging just doesn't look the same. So don't do that. Sponge paint first and then glue your little yellow hash marks on. And the best part about this costume is that while I was out thrifting, I found this orange jumpsuit that is super cheap. It's not great material. And one of my thrifting buddies was like, I feel like you need this orange jumpsuit. I don't even know what you could do with it, but I feel like you need it. So I bought it because I was like, I feel like I need it too. And the more I thought about it, I was like, oh my gosh, this would be perfect for this costume. So I am going to take this orange jumpsuit and honestly, I'm just using regular spray paint. I'm spray painting the bottom of the legs and the arms. That way it has that yellow to orange contrast. And ooh, I am excited. It looks so good.